In this video, I want to go ahead and take a look at the watercolor properties that we can find over here when we have the watercolor tool selected. So the very first thing that I want to point out to you is going to be that what we're going to be getting when we control these sliders is going to be relative to the type of brush that we currently have selected. So the brush is going to have a big impact on what we get when we adjust these sliders. That's an important thing to remember. Now, the very first thing I want to do is I want to come over here to the flat menu and I want to choose to reset properties so that we're all seeing the same default properties that I'm seeing here. Now, the first slider here is going to be pretty self-explanatory. It's the size slider. You can see that I can increase the size by simply dragging this up. I can decrease the size by dragging it down. Now, these are not in pixel values. This is in a percent value, meaning that there's a maximum size that a watercolor brush can reach. It's going to be different than the size that we might reach for something like, say, the pencil or the ink. So you want to bear in mind that the size that we're getting here is going to be relative to the type of media that we're using. The next one down is going to be pressure. Now, what I want to do is I want to come over here and I want to pause diffusion for a second. We're going to be using a color of black. And what I want to do is I want to look at what pressure is doing. So first, I'll come over here and I'll increase the pressure all the way to 100%, and I'll make a mark. And what you can see is that we're getting fairly strong coverage over the entire surface of the paper. But as I decrease the pressure, you're going to see that we're going to be getting lighter strokes, and we're also going to be getting less coverage over that texture of the paper until eventually we get low enough on this that we're going to start to see the texture of the paper through here. This is going to be something that's very different when we switch brushes. So if I come over here to the mop and I do the same thing, so I'll start at 100% and I'll go ahead and make a mark, and you're going to see I get very even coverage, but I see a little texture here at the beginning. And then if I come down a bit and I go ahead and make a mark, you can see I see a lot more of that texture. And if I come down to about the middle point, you can see I'm seeing more of that texture and less of the paint. And then as I get really low, you'll see I see hardly any of the paint at all. And I'm just mostly filling in the grain of the paper texture that we have here for the canvas. Now, what's important to understand is that if I come over here and I view the wet, you'll see that this is going to affect the water as well. So this is not just a pigment effect. It's also going to be affecting the amount of water that's coming down. And it's going to be relative to the brush settings. The idea of the pressure is that this is controlling not only the pressure sensitivity of the mark that we're making if the brush has pressure sensitivity, but then it's also controlling the density of the stroke, not just in terms of opacity, but also in terms of the coverage of the canvas in the instance that a brush has the ability to interact with the canvas texture. So the pressure is going to be very, very important in terms of the type of character that you're going to be getting from your brushes. Now, typically speaking, there are controls within the brush settings themselves that are going to allow you to control the characteristics of the pressure. So my feeling is that it's probably better to leave this at the default of 50 and then go ahead and change the settings inside the brush settings themselves rather than trying to change it here constantly. However, if you're wanting more than one character from the brush that you're using, then you can certainly make those changes right here by adjusting the pressure slider. Here you can see I can get very different character from this brush by simply adjusting that pressure slider. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to clear this because I don't want to actually have that diffuse. I'm going to turn off the view wet for right now. And I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to talk about the loading. So here we have a pressure of 50%. So if I go ahead and make a mark, you can see this is what I have. The loading is going to be the amount of pigment that's in the mixture that we're going to be painting down. So if I set this all the way to 100 and I go ahead and make a similar mark, you can see I have a lot more pigment in that mixture. Whereas if I come over here and I set it all the way down to 1, what you can see is I have a lot less pigment in that mixture. However, if I come over here and I view wet, you can see that I basically have the same amount of water in all three. So the idea here is that we're separating out the pigment from the water when we're painting down. So you basically want to set the amount of pigment with the loading slider the way you want it. And then what you would want to do is you would want to come over here and adjust the water slider to control the amount of water, which controls the diffusion. So here I'll go ahead and I'll set the water at 100, and you can see we have a lot of water going down. And then I'll come over here and I'll set it down to about 50, which is where we were by default. And then I'm going to go ahead and set it down fairly low, somewhere around, say, 11. And I'm going to go ahead and paint it down. And you're going to see we have a lot less water. Now, the important thing to understand is that if I turn off the view wet, you can see that the three strokes are basically the same. And the reason why was because they were all using the same loading. So the color that's going to be painted down by the mark is not going to change. The only thing that's going to change when we adjust the water is going to be the amount of diffusion. And we'll see this in just one second. I'm going to come over here and unpause the diffusion. And you can see that the diffusion for these three strokes is very, very different. However, the color of them, the intensity of that black, is basically the same. And the reason why is because we had a fairly low loading, whereas if we had increased the loading, we would have a darker stroke. But again, the water is controlling only the diffusion characteristic. So you can see with these three sliders that we can really get different characteristics from all of our brushes. And like I say, you want to adjust them on a per brush basis because each brush is going to give you different results based on the sliders themselves. Now that said, I'm going to come over here and clear this. And I want to come over here and do one more thing. I'm going to come over to Window. I'm going to come down to Visual Settings. Now I'm not going to actually talk about the visual settings because I've already recorded a video that talks about visual settings, and that's going to be in the New Features series. And the important thing to understand about what we're doing when we're setting these settings here is that there's going to be qualities of our watercolor that are not controlled by these settings. They're going to be controlled by what's going on under watercolor behavior over here. Things like absorbency, edge darkening, canvas influence, and even the drips are going to be controlled separately from what we're getting up here. So when you're thinking about controlling your watercolors, you want to think about these three sliders right here, pressure, loading, and water. But you also want to go ahead and watch the video that I made for the visual settings so that you can understand what absorbency, edge darkening, and canvas influence are going to do to the marks that your brush is making as well.